Hello, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. This webinar is organized by the Centers of International Business Education at Michigan State and Texas A&M Universities as part of our Research Spotlight series. This is the beginning of our third year with these webinars, and today's webinar is our 11th of these series. The topic of today's webinar is the meaning of brands in an increasingly complex world. For this webinar, we invited 3 global marketing scholars who have published important work in global branding area with specific focus on the meaning of brands across cultures. Our panelists will discuss their perspectives on addressing contemporary conceptual and methodological best practices necessary for publishing work in this area in major journals. This webinar will include short presentations followed by a discussion moderated by the co-hosts. David Griffith and I will be your co-hosts today. David is the Holly Vanderhider Chair in Business, Professor of Marketing, and Associate Director of Research at the Center for International Business Studies at Texas A&M University. I'm Ahmet Kırca. I'm an Associate Professor of International Business and Marketing at Michigan State University, Broad College. I also serve as the Director of the International Business Center at MSU. I'm delighted and honored to present you our esteemed panelists today. First, I would like to thank you and for agreeing to join us for today's webinar. Today, our first speaker is Professor Claudio Alvarez from Baylor University. Claudio is an associate professor at Hankamer School of Business, and his research investigates brands, brand meaning, and consumer brand relationships with a particular focus on questions that have strategic implications to marketing practice and to consumers' well-being. His research has been published in leading marketing journals, such as the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Consumer Psychology, and others. Our next panelist is Elif Isberk-Bilgin from the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Elif's research focuses on consumer activism, Islamic marketing, branding, and sociological aspects of consumerism in emerging markets. Her work has been published in the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, among others. And our third panelist is Professor Ela Veresiu from School of Business at York University. Ela's research focuses on understanding and promoting consumer diversity and market inclusion at the interplay of identity, technology, branding, and institutions. Her work has appeared in leading journals in marketing, including Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Advertising, among others. Now, I will pass the proverbial microphone back to David, who will lead the discussions during the panel and take the questions from the audience. Enjoy.
Howdy, everyone. Before I turn it over to the panelists, please place any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A or in the chat. You can also send them directly to me. I will be accumulating the questions for our dynamic Q&A session after the presentations. With that said, let me turn the floor over to Claudio. Share your screen and let's see what you got.
Thank you for inviting me to present on this so fascinating topic. Can you see my screen? Is that okay? So today in our first 10 minutes, I wanted to share a perspective on what is cultural about brand meanings. So when we talk about cultural meanings, what are we referring to? And I also grappled a little bit with the complex side of this seminar. So how can this perspective help us understand the complexity of our current times? In at least a couple of ways it does it. And then share some methodological perspectives also on how we, especially as qualitative researchers, we approach the cultural meanings of brands. So first, when we talk about cultural meanings, we're referring to what happens when people use shared models, shared cultural models to make sense of their everyday lives and experiences in life. So just to give an example, When I had my second child, I realized the family was growing and it was time to buy a bigger car. I was a big fan of Toyota. My older child really liked the sliding doors. So I thought that a minivan would be a great idea until I asked my wife about it. And for her, she interpreted that experience of buying the minivan through the cultural model of the soccer mom, which, for those of you who are not in the US, is a somewhat shared model of moms in a particular suburban context. And it was not, for her, it was not a great experience, right? So to the extent that she had those thoughts of like, is that really me? Is that who I want to be? Buying the minivan gained a whole different meaning for her versus me. And that's what we refer to as the cultural meaning of that particular car for her, right? Because she was using that cultural model of the soccer mom to make sense of the experience of buying a new car. What are the kinds of cultural models that we have investigated in qualitative research? So myths and cultural narratives is a big source of research in this topic. So just to give one example, Corona in the 90s, it became highly successful in the US, not only because it owned like a general brand association of partying, but because they owned a specific version of that association that came from the myth of the Mexican spring break. Metaphors are another cultural model that help us experience one brand in a particular way. So when we think about the fist, we tend to associate it with control, power, and that can be used to make sense of the Pirelli brand, just like in this ad. Ideologies have also been a big focus of work in consumer research. And this is an example from Varman and Belk's paper. And they looked in India at the Swadeshi ideology and how it helped consumers frame that general brand association between Coca-Cola and America in a very specific way, right? In India, if you think of Coca-Cola and America as the Western imperialistic power, a good way to approach this brand is to go away from it, actually, to start consuming the local brands, which is consistent with the Swadeshi ideology. And a fourth, yes?
A real quick clarification question
Sure.
from the audience, which speaks to our global nature of our audience. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by soccer mom?
Oh, yes. And maybe others in the US can help too. So this image of the soccer mom is very much what happens. So our older kid actually played soccer, and I came from Brazil. So for me, it was a big deal to understand how it works. There is a whole operation related to sports in the US. So it's all based on leagues. And so my kid had to be a part of a league, and it would practice during the week. And then over the weekends, we have the games. And you typically, the minivans become a useful way to deal with it, because now you have all the apparatus that you take with you and with your kids to the different soccer places. Did I explain the soccer mom well enough, David?
I think that's really good. I would add to that, at least from my perspective, I think oftentimes the soccer moms get classified as sort of middle to upper income, oftentimes Caucasian, care about Lululemon, and kind of cart kids around all the time.
And I think it's also related to the roles assigned to women in the society. That's really the biggest difference between US and elsewhere, because when you look at the soccer mom concept, well, that concept includes a mom who doesn't work full time, who has to drive around with the kids and then communicates with the parents of other kids and shares those responsibilities. And that's why the big car, right? And then you can put your balls in there, all the other kids, and drive around for the entire day from one practice to the other. And that's not really sometimes what women want to be affiliated or associated with.
Right. And thank you for the question, because it does speak to the nature of cultural models. Like if you are not from the US, or before I came here, I didn't quite understand what was going on. But if you live in the culture, you have access to the whole network of meanings that are associated with that particular cultural model of being in this case. Thank you. So going back to the last example of a cultural model is what Holt and others have, based on Bourdieu's work, have talked about as taste or habitus, that to the extent that a particular social group shares experiences together, upbringing, education, they develop specific lifestyles and tastes that are associated with that social group, even if you don't know about it. So this work from Moisiu and colleagues has investigated the do-it-yourself project. It's another very American experience where you, again, not big on me because I'm not from the US, but there is this idea that you will work as typically men will work in the house and will do furniture and have their own little woodwork capacities and work on projects in the home. And they have looked at how, particularly contrasting higher cultural capital men versus lower cultural capital or lower class men, how the meaning of these do-it-yourself projects changed a lot, and the meanings of brands that were associated with these do-it-yourself projects change a lot depending on your social group, your social class. From higher class men that tend to think of these projects as almost like as a form of therapy, right? Where you can try your self-realization, so you achieve something using the brands that can help you and become or be like a craftsman during the weekend, whereas lower class men typically talked about do-it-yourself projects as a form of work, right? As saving money, not really related to brands, but thinking more of the tools as an extension of their bodies versus an enabler of something they wouldn't otherwise have access to. So to the extent that we use myths, metaphors, ideologies, or tastes to make sense of these brands and to bring meaning to these brands, we're referring to the cultural meanings that they have. So how do I think, trying to be a little provocative, maybe not too much, how do I think this perspective can help us understand complexity? One of the ways is that when you think of cultural meanings through the lens of cultural models, you don't have to assume that culture equals nation or country or ethnicity, right? So we have investigated as consumer behavior researchers cultural models that operate at this national level. So when we talk about caste in India or the model of harmonization in Vietnam, those tend to be associated with countries, but they don't have to, right? So we have looked at models that operate within nations, like respectability among the middle class African Americans in the US, or also across nations, like the idea of the global youth. Or even now in our digital marketplace, you can look at how these models are shared within groups that don't exist within geographic boundaries, right? So digital groups like the Fashionistas, or also online brand communities. So they create their own cultural models. And if you relax the assumption that a culture is a nation, you can now use theories to understand both types of processes. You understand that these processes are not necessarily the same just because they're not within cultural boundaries. So in that sense, it's useful to deal with a world where, at least in my opinion, these national models are becoming less important in guiding how we think and how we behave, right? So we can be a little bit more flexible. And the second is that we can also think of our theories on branding as investigating cultural models. So I do a lot of research on the relationships that consumers have with brands. And what we see is that consumers draw from cultural models of relating, right? So brand love, or even the relational norms that guide how we relate to people, we use those ideas from the interpersonal domain, those models from the interpersonal domain, to make sense of how we relate to brands. And to the extent that these cultural models of relating are changing in our interpersonal experiences, we are also seeing similar changes in how we relate to brands, right? So we don't have to think of our theories as necessarily fixed, but as how they draw from these cultural models that are associated with branding. Just like the whole idea that we use brands to extend ourselves or to express our identities or to tell ourselves and other people who we are, this is also a cultural model, right? It's not a necessity, and it probably varies across cultural contexts. So to the extent that we think about it this way, we can also think of branding and ideas related to branding as a topic for investigation, something that we can understand how it varies from cultural context to cultural context. To give some ideas on how we go about investigating the cultural meanings of brands, a key focus is on the meaning makers, right? So a good approach is to think, who are the people who are creating these meanings, who are proposing cultural models, attaching them to brands, and what are the motivations and how they do it. So these are the most well-researched, try to create some categories of what we look into. Of course, marketers and consumers are big meaning makers, but also other entities, other players like the media and entertainment industries and expert systems. More and more, we're talking about influencers and other people that create meanings for the brands. And from a more specifically methodological standpoint, people tend to think of qualitative research in terms of in-depth interviews, and yes, we can do that. Also, ethnographic field work, where like you want to understand India, you go to India. You want to understand Turkey, you go to Turkey. But there are also other methodological approaches, and more we're seeing multi-method qualitative research and papers like archival research, oral history, looking at doing analysis of the media and the entertainment industry's output. So this is the type of thing that we do. So when we want to investigate how brands gain cultural meaning, we look at the meaning makers from a multi-method standpoint. And of course, not only qualitative, but quantitative methods have been used as well, especially Humphreys and other researchers. So just to sum it up, because my time is probably up, we look at the cultural particulars, right? So we sometimes look at specific cases, specific people, specific geographic locations, not because we are fond of exotic places and people, but because we understand that by understanding those cultural particulars, we can make generalizations about how we relate to people and how we relate to brands, while also paying attention to those specific mental representations. So we try to abstract theories from particulars without losing ourselves in the abstractness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudio. That was wonderful. If you could stop your screen share at this point. We got a couple of questions that have come into me, so we'll handle those at the Q&A at the end. All registered participants will receive a link to a recording that will probably happen next week. It'll come out next week. And then also the recording of this webinar will be available on the Texas A&M Center for International Business Studies YouTube channel as well. With that said, let me turn it over to our next presenter. Elif, if you'd like to share your screen and take the floor.
Sure. Thank you, David. You're able to see the screen? Great. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you, David and Ahmed, for this wonderful opportunity to present at your Research Spotlight series. Since we have such a diverse audience, and I don't know how well-versed our audience is in the branding literature, I thought I would start with giving everyone some context by providing a quick review of the branding research. As you may know, this is a vast and deep literature. So, and there are many interesting constructs like brand identity, personality, brand authenticity, and many more, each of which could constitute their own literature stream, if you will. So I wanted to focus our discussion on three aspects of this literature. First, I will be talking a little bit about brands as vessels of cultural meaning, which is going to resonate a lot with what Claudia was talking about earlier. Then I will talk a little bit about brand love, relationships, and communities, and then talk a little bit about brand hate and consumer activism. These are some of the areas that my research dovetails with, before finishing off with some suggestions for future research and a brief discussion of how we can expand on this extensive literature base. So this is gonna echo some of the things that Claudia has already mentioned, but in the earlier days, marketers approached branding almost with an engineer's perspective. So the idea was that if you built a better mousetrap, that consumers would come to you. Without paying attention to any of the significance or the meanings that brands may hold for consumers. So it was just a very functional view of branding and marketing. But this understanding began to change over time, especially thanks to the important research and work of scholars and working in consumer culture theory paradigm. Their research, scholars like Douglas Holt, Russ Belk, Melanie Wollendorf, and Craig Thompson, their research uncovers the importance of possessions for consumers. And perhaps we can take away three key insights from all their work. First, brands are vessels of cultural meaning. And as Claudia was saying, myths, metaphors, and ideologies are important resources for creating brand meanings. Second, it's not just the marketers, but also consumers who assign meanings to brands. So this meaning-making process is actually a multi-actor process. And again, as Claudia was saying earlier, it includes governments, scientists, doctors, cultural interpreters. So it's not just the marketer. And the third takeaway might be that brand meanings are dynamic. So over time, they may lose touch with the cultural zeitgeist and therefore lose their relevancy and their meaning for and legitimacy in the eyes of consumers. Because we tend to attach deep meanings to brands, we also tend to form relationships and we tend to bond with brands, so much so that Ahuvia and colleagues have, through their work, they have showed that consumers develop feelings of love, expressing passion, commitment to certain brands. And these loved brands are very important. They're identity markers for consumers because consumers then integrate these brands into their lifestyles to project an ideal self or a desired self. And, of course, naturally, those strong feelings deliver managerially relevant outcomes as well, such as brand loyalty, increased word of mouth, willingness to pay a premium for the brand, trust, and even forgiveness in case the brand would, commit a faux pas. And brand love lends itself very easily into this notion of seeing brands as our relationship partners. And Claudia was presenting here today, and colleagues like Susan Fournier have explored this notion in their research. They had identified many different types of relationships with varying intensity and duration. Brand love also lends itself easily and translates into consumers' participation in a brand community. So whether it's the devoted Apple product owners or Harley Davidson riders, Mini Cooper car owners, or even Lego fans, these consumers enjoy spending time with a group of like-minded others, and they may embark on adventures, riding their bikes. They may share technical advice and offer technical support to each other in the case of discontinued brands, or in the case of Lego fans, they may get together to co-create new designs. which are also very important for companies, of course. So the flip side of the coin, I find it equally interesting, and this is where my research explores a little bit. So when we assign significant cultural meanings to brands and when we develop strong feelings for them, it's equally likely that those feelings will translate into love as much as hate, brand hate, especially if that's the case when the brand is ideologically opposed to our values, our identity, or our lifestyle. And this notion of negative emotions that one feels toward brands have been explored in a variety of constructs, under a variety of constructs, like oppositional brand loyalty, brand dislike, brand avoidance, and brand hate. Also, a group of scholars have approached and explored this relationship between strong negative emotions and how they foster consumer activism. So, for example, in my research, I find that certain global brands are perceived as symbols of cultural imperialism, and they're contested as such. Likewise, Ella's research, and I'm sure she will do a better job of talking about it than I do, but her research shows that in the current sociocultural environment, at least in the US and some other countries, certain brands are perceived as promoting a racist ideology. And therefore, consumers protest these brands on social media and elsewhere. So given this extensive state of literature, what else we can do? What could researchers explore next? Well, luckily, there are still some areas that have not been heavily studied. One such area might be, if you're interested in working on brand love and relationships, it's a possibility of exploring secret relationships that consumers might be having with stigmatized brands. So once again, referring to the American context and this ideologically divided environment, certain brands like Fox News and Truth Social social media platform are stigmatized by liberals, whereas brands like CNN and New York Times are stigmatized by conservatives. Also, companies that partner with celebrities might find their brands being stigmatized in the face of inappropriate conduct by these celebrities, like in the case of Adidas' partnership with Kanye West, following this rapper's racist comments. So then, and there are other examples of stigmatized products in the markets. One can think of fast food brands or oil companies and their brands, tobacco companies and their brands. The consumer attitudes about these products and brands have been shifting in the recent years, so they are becoming stigmatized products as well as stigmatized brands. Another interesting avenue for some might be to explore brand hate notion in further depth. We could, for example, explore the under which conditions brand hate might turn into love. And if that happens, whether we see alternate types of relationships in that case. And finally, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the intersection of religion, brands, and identity. This is an area that interests me most nowadays, and I find it curious that marketing scholars are not perhaps paying as much attention as we should be to religion and how it operates in the market. I find it curious because if you think about it, the number one managerial advice to companies that researchers or consultants might give is that create a religious zeal for your brands among consumers. Well, it turns out we preach about it, but we still have a limited understanding of how actually religion works in consumer culture and in the marketplace, and more importantly, how religion may create loyalty beyond reason. Another surprising thing to me is that we still have relatively little understanding of religion, given its important role in our consumption behavior. So if you think about it, religion governs what we eat, how we dress, when we might embrace or abstain from certain practices. Some faiths have rules governing our lives throughout our lifetime. So think about it from cradle to grave kind of thing. So for example, if you're a Christian Pentecostal, you have to donate 10% of your income to the church. Or if you're a Mormon, you have to abstain from caffeine all your life. And for even more devout believers, religion may pose even more significant implications, like determining how you invest your retirement savings, how you invest your money, whether you're going to invest it in Sharia compliant investments or elsewhere, or which political party you're going to vote for, and which media channel you're going to turn in to listen to get your news. On a collective level, religion serves as a social glue, tying us to communities and subcultures. And these communities may have their own rules governing our behavior. So they may dictate which products we may use or may not use, which brands we may use or may not use. So far we have explored brands as religion. So recent research or past research has looked at certain brands and how they evoke religiosity like feelings. These are cult brands like Apple or GE Harley Davidson. So they evoke in consumer strong feelings, religiosity. But we haven't really looked at religion as a powerful meaning system and what it means. That means from consumption perspective and from the perspective of the marketplace. And we haven't really explored religions as global brands too much. So those are the two areas where I see some growth or some potential for future research. So let's talk about the first one. Religion can be a powerful meaning system, offering consumers mythical narratives, for example, that consumers may embrace to deal with their everyday life. So they may, for example, use these mythical narratives to contest certain hegemonic forces that they feel like they're experiencing in their lives. Consider the Golden Age myth. This originates in classic Greek mythology. It refers to this idealized period of time when everything is great, it's all peace, harmony, stability, and prosperity. Interestingly, though, each faith group puts their spin on this Golden Age myth and uses this myth for their ideological purposes. So in my research, I find that this Islamic Golden Age idea is imagined as a period or as an antidote against the problems that modernity, globalization, and capitalism brings about. And Islamist consumers contest those global brands that they perceive to be a threat to the original Islamic community, which refers to the Prophet's time, Prophet Muhammad's time, and his original group of believers. So they believe that period of time was an ideal time in terms of justice, morality, and equal society. And today's capitalist society is nothing close to that. So there are a lot of moral judgments about consumption objects and brands that's taking place here as some consumers reject global brands, which they perceive to be a threat to these ideals. Interestingly, though, the same myth may also foster new brands and new product offerings like Islamic resorts, Islamic magazines, or Islamic toys. And the entrepreneurs who are bringing these products or brands to the market usually intend this as a practice or an exercise in correcting the wrongs of the capitalist marketplace. And they see this as a practice or exercise in injecting their morals into the society, into the marketplace. But of course, Islam is not the only faith that nurtures this idea of golden age. Some of you may be familiar with the QAnon conspiracy theories. For the believers of QAnon, the term the Great Awakening is quite important, and it's a religiously charged term that refers to the Christian revival. And again, for this group of believers, they think that the former President Trump is a messianic figure who's going to salvage America's identity as a true Christian nation. So we can see once again this whole idea of golden age of Christianity as opposed to golden age of Islam, inspiring QAnon branded merchandise in the marketplace, or also inspiring most of the Christian services and products that we see in the marketplace. We can also explore religions as brands. I think we can do a better job of that and a more systematic job at that. We can specifically look at actors, institutions, and movements in doing so. We hardly recognize them as such, but these are actual global brands. They have followers and brand equities in the millions. And when we study these actors, institutions, and movements, we have to realize that they cross borders. So for those of you who are interested in international marketing, international business, we can think of these as brands and or institutions crossing borders, making decisions, strategies about entering new markets. We can take a look at how they maintain brand authenticity in different cultures, how they manage their brands in the face of a cultural criticism, perhaps, or scandals. These could be all questions of interest working in international marketing and business area. Some of you may already be familiar with Joel Osteen, who's here on the picture on the slide, who's a very rich and famous pastorpreneur. You may also be familiar with Scientology, but you may not be as familiar with religious service movements who operate almost like corporations, global corporations, preaching the prosperity gospel and doing some significant developmental work in less developed areas in the world. So one such movement is the Gabat Kalinga movement from Philippines. They perceive themselves, and here I have a quote from a member, they perceive themselves as a global company that is exporting their business model. And in doing so, they're partnering with other global brands like McDonald's, Pepsi, Coke, and Procter & Gamble. I think these movements deserve our attention, the attention of marketing scholars, because they can become so large and they can become so influential that, in fact, some of these movements have created their own sub-economy, and they have their own currency, if you believe it. And then they can become so influential that they can have rules, they can dictate what we are supposed to consume or what we are supposed to avoid. As one last example of how religious actors and institutions may change the facade of the marketplace is the context of faith-based markets. And in particular, I have here as an example, the halal market, which has been growing exponentially over the last few years. And many multinationals are quite interested in this movement, Nestle among them, Unilever, KFC, Walmart, Carrefour are all jumping into this bandwagon. But far from being a small, family-owned business, an ethnic business, the actual halal market is a global movement of a network of actors. We have supranational organizations, for example, involved in the global halal market. One example is the Organization of Islamic Countries with 57 nation states, members. Governments are involved, the government of Pakistan, Indonesia, and Turkey. Manufacturers, like I mentioned before, like Nestle, are involved. And even global media and consulting companies like Ogilvy Mather and JWT are involved in this effort. And when we're talking about faith-based markets, it's not just the halal market. I wouldn't necessarily want you to think it in that way. There's an equally interesting and even a bigger faith-based market when you consider spiritual tourism or when you consider religious products and services. So I hope I didn't exceed my time, but in closing, I hope this presentation stimulates some interesting theoretical questions about the intersection of religion and brands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elif. That was wonderful. Keep your questions coming. Jose, I see your question in the Q&A. We will handle that at the end of the presentations. And I will turn the floor over to Ella.
Thank you very much, David and Ahmed, for this wonderful opportunity to present today. So I hope everybody can see my screen. Wonderful. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I will like to briefly talk about two research projects of mine. And so I decided to title today's talk From Racialized to Inclusive Brands. Now, thank you so much, Claudio and Elif, for setting the stage. I think that we can all agree at this point that branding theory and practice has really evolved from a firm-centric, attribute-oriented approach to a collaborative, dynamic, and social practice. And there were a slew of examples that you've heard so far in our time today. So in a recent paper of mine published in the Journal of the Association for Consumer Research, the special issue on racism and discrimination in the marketplace that Elif alluded to, I set out to understand how our racialized brands terminated. And through this project, I define racialized brands as those that employ racial stereotypes to enliven themselves. Now, before we get to the conceptual piece, the research spark for this project came over really a shock of mine that, if you can see on the slide, 7 years almost to the date, in the same national newspaper in Germany, the same global company, Unilever, spoke out first against changing a negative racialized brand and a racialized brand name by the name of gypsy sauce, which is a very popular condiment in the German marketplace, akin to ketchup and mustard used for meat and other barbecue sauces. And despite activist calls for the name change in 2013, the brand decided that there was no negative connotation, and their publicist came out and said they would not change gypsy sauce brand name. And 7 years later, the same company came out in the same newspaper, probably with a different PR employee, saying that all of a sudden the term gypsy sauce can be interpreted negatively. So they have decided to change their name to Hungarian-style paprika sauce. Now, for those of you that are not very familiar, the word gypsy is a disparaging term for a visible minority who self-identify as Roma in Europe. Now, conceptually, legitimation is a process through which a market entity, be it a product, idea, or industry, becomes commonly accepted. Less studied, but it's starting to be increasingly so, is this idea of delegitimization, which we can think of as demonstrating the absence of positive, beneficial, ethical, and or understandable action of a market entity in the marketplace. So in a nutshell, my study uncovered two public discourses in the media, anti-racism and social tolerating, that were used to delegitimize the racialized brand, gypsy sauce, while also ensuring the legitimacy of the company, in this case, Unilever. But ultimately, the key takeaway that I want to leave you here today is that racialized brands can negatively affect marginalized consumers and manipulate target consumers who may not be the ethnic consumers, but rather mainstream population, by shaping their understandings of race. So my article does caution brand managers against commodifying the anti-racism and social tolerating discourses for purely profit maximization purposes. If you're wondering about more details of the findings, rest assured, here they are, but I do not want to go into them in greater detail today. I do encourage those of you that are interested in learning more about this particular racialized brand and the public discourses in 2013 that were used to legitimize it, and the 2 public discourses in 2020 that were used to delegitimize it in the popular press from a wide variety of stakeholders, as Claudio also talked about in his presentation. Please do read my article. Because now I want to turn to the future research directions stemming from this study. So I encourage all of us, and for those of you that are interested in branding research, to move beyond and study delegitimization processes of racialized brands beyond those found in the food product category. So for example, in recent years, there have been scandals in the luxury fashion industry of racialized products, of which I have a few photos, as well as activism and conversations around racialized sports brands. Should they exist? Should they not? Their mascots, particularly in the US context. So here are 2 research questions that can guide future scholars. One is, how can materiality affect the process of racialized luxury fashion brands delegitimization? And another potentially interesting question is, how do fans' political affiliations influence their engagement with racialized sports brands, one way or another? So next, I want to talk to you about a project that is currently ongoing. So here, my co-author and I are looking at what is an inclusive brand and how can inclusive brands be built. The spark for this project comes from the global fashion industry, which is estimated at $3 trillion and probably more so today. But so far it has paid really scant attention to issues of race and age, sexual identity, body size, and disability. They focused on really a certain vision of what it means to be fashionable in the marketplace. So here we define inclusive brands as going beyond tokenism to consider, embrace, and include consumers, as well as all other relevant stakeholders, including employees, suppliers, brand ambassadors, influencers, not just from various races and ethnicities, but also various ages and genders, incomes, body types, sexualities, and abilities. And we think of inclusivity in the branding context more as a continuum, rather than a rigid structure of a brand is either inclusive or not inclusive. One of the things that we caution brand managers in this paper is to not engage in what we term as inclusivity washing, which we define as artificially engaging with stakeholder DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in branding efforts to appeal to previously marginalized groups, including, but also beyond race and ethnicity. And 2 examples that we argue have engaged in inclusivity washing in the fashion industry include Nike, that used an exclusive rollout model for a disability-friendly Go Fly Easy shoes, and Kim Kardashian for her Skims line that hired ex-Victoria's Secret Angels for her quote-unquote inclusive underwear brand. Now, so far our findings in this project, we do look at institutional work, which speaks to individuals or groups that engage in work that either shores up, tears down, or transforms institutions. And we argue that brands are one such institution. And we identified 3 forms of institutional work used by entrepreneurs in the fashion industry to build more inclusive brands, which we term practicing brand multiformity. That means collaborating with diverse models, influencers, consumers, partners, suppliers, and employees. Practicing brand materiality, which is designing more inclusive products, services, and stores, including change rooms. and practicing brand morality, which we term as creating inclusive messaging, campaigns, a distribution approach, and pricing. And so the last thing that I want to leave you with today, this last idea that we're currently grappling with in our project, is how can marketing professionals reconcile segmentation, targeting, and positioning, which, as we all know, is a keystone of marketing and branding practice, if one wants to build truly a more inclusive brand. And that's it from my end today. Thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent job. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I've received a whole bunch of comments from different people. We've also got one in the Q&A. I'm kind of going to go a little bit in order, but I'll throw these open to everyone. So I've got some specifics. So first I'm going to go to Claudio, if that's okay. A question came up pertaining to the discussion of sort of national, and then you had talked about like the youth culture, right, which sort of goes across the globe. So a question came up is, what are your thoughts about the sort of these global cultures forming meetings around brands in an era of divisiveness and deglobalization?
That's a great question. And I see both. My intuition is that you have both effects going on, right? So you have deterritorialization. So you have people forming groups at different levels, especially online, right? And sometimes you can get at the same time very specific small groups with very specific domains, and they will probably cut across geographies quite substantially. And sometimes you have larger tents where people will so you'll see both effects. And that was kind of my point, that to the extent that you can identify these groups that share those cultural models, from a theoretical standpoint, you can use similar theories and ideas to understand both processes. So in a way, like the world where nations were the key organizing principle has shifted quite a few decades ago, but has still been shifting into a world where you see, especially from a marketing standpoint, more interest-based, more ideology-based, or smaller groups, and that will guide more of your decision-making.
Excellent, excellent. Let me follow up on that just quickly.
Yep.
So from a research standpoint, we can use qualitative methodology to sort of understand that. From a sort of a brand manager standpoint, could we use like natural language software and scrape sort of what's the comments that are coming across different markets to understand the meaning of our brands?
Yes, I am not particularly versed in this area, but I'm looking at it with excitement. So I think all marketers and pretty much everybody is quite excited about the availability of these language models, and that's one of the benefits for the researcher, that a lot of the discourse around brands happen online. So it is like available to the researcher through these large language models. I do see a lot of promise in that domain. I think maybe Ella or Elif know better. I know Cozenet has published, I don't know if it was a book chapter or a paper on that specific topic. So I don't see, some people see it as like you're losing a lot of the granularity of the data if you're using these large language models, and of course you are, but you also gain a different level of access to what's going on. So I see both hopefully as complementing each other, the more in-depth person-to-person qualitative and the more quantitative perspectives as
I myself am not very well versed in those methodologies, but I know of some recent research that is looking at and this can be a really promising avenue for research. It is as labor intensive, interestingly, as qualitative research if you have to create dictionaries and whatnot. But I find some researchers are working on detecting a group's emotions, for example, a public's mood, if you will, and how brand managers can utilize this public mood in their promotions, whether they should go against this mood, like if it's a fearful environment like we are experiencing right now with 2 wars taking place at the same time, should brand managers go with more fearful approaches or more happy approaches? So there are new, there's new research coming out on that, and it's really promising, really exciting.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to keep you on the spot for a second because the next question is for you, Elif. If the idea of brand imperialism perception a very US focused? I mean, some consumers complain about one brand here in the US, but consumer outside of the US may have a different relationship with the same brand. How do you handle the dichotomy?
Sure, it's a great question, and I don't think brand imperialism necessarily is US specific. You can see it in smaller contexts or in other countries, other nations, other cultures as well. Basically, it's the idea of a power dynamic, right? One culture feeling superior vis-a-vis the other. So if you were to, for example, ask Kurdish entrepreneurs in Turkey, they would tell you about the imperialism that's taking place from the Turkish public or the Turkish government. And if you were to talk to indigenous people in Australia, they could complain about similar issues. And if you talk to Native Americans in the US, they could also talk about similar issues when it comes to access to the marketplace, access to products, or marketing their indigenous products, selling their indigenous products. So for global brands, it's definitely a difficult question to handle, and it requires a lot of tightrope walking. But the challenge is to balance your audiences. As a global brand, you have to have a global identity, if you will, a global presentation, but at the same time, you can play with cultural elements and tune into cultural sentiments to give a more localized take on your brand.
Excellent, excellent. The next question will be to Ella. Can you further explain the examples of inclusivity washing? It was very interesting.
Yep, absolutely. And I'll share my screen again. So the argument we are making here is that if there is a mismatch among brand multiformity, brand materiality, and brand morality, then it could lead to inclusive washing. So in other words, if you brand managers are not thorough and complete in their initiatives to truly be more inclusive, if they have inclusive messaging but don't use a wide variety of models, for example, if their storefronts and their online store presence is not built from a more inclusive platform. So overall, if there is a misalignment in any of the 3 practices that we have identified, then it could more easily lead to activist consumers and other stakeholders calling out the brand for just being inclusive in one aspect, to jump on the DEI bandwagon without really caring for the previously or currently marginalized community or communities that they are trying to reach. I hope that answers the question.
It does great job. I couldn't find my mute button on that one, so great job. We do have a question in the Q&A, and I think Ahmed and I are going to take the first stab at this one because it says we discuss meaning of brands in increasingly complex world. How do you define complexity? And the reason I said Ahmed and I will take this first is because we actually titled this webinar. So all blame falls on us. All blame falls on us, and I think me personally on this one. So I'll start and Ahmed will comment, and then I'd like to hear from our speakers how they viewed it, because we did just kind of thrust the topic upon you. I was looking at the issue of complexity in the world from two perspectives. One is, as our presenters have spoken to, it's become harder to manage a brand because at one time you controlled the message. But really over the last decade or so, we no longer as brand managers control the message. We are managing in an ecosystem where oftentimes even what you're saying becomes distorted and becomes a meme and just sort of, so that from that perspective, the communication model is cyclical in many ways where it wasn't before. So that was one aspect of complexity. And the second that I was thinking of is more from an institutional economic perspective, whether we're talking about institutionalism from an organizational standpoint or from an international economic standpoint. I come at this very much from the institutional economic standpoint, and I love Ashley's work on delegitimization and legitimization because it all fits right into this context of what are the formal and informal institutions. Are they coming together or are they growing apart? Because as you see them start to separate, you do get those aspects of deglobalization. Ahmed, would you like to say a few words on sort of how you were viewing it as we started this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think the world I agree with what you said, especially the first part regarding how the world has changed over the last 20 or so years. And two major drivers of that change is the globalization or deglobalization. I'm not really a big fan of deglobalization arguments because I still believe that we live in a semi-global world, as Gemawat had always argued. I mean, it's not, we were never in a global world, and we're not going to deglobalization. These are just shifts from one side to the other. And sometimes international trade gets lower and foreign direct investment becomes the more norm. And then there are other shifts, risks, and so on that really prevent firms going abroad, and they rely more on international trade. Those are the two pillars of international business, right? So, so the world has changed drastically, and these shifts are just taking place faster from one side to the other. We just start to talk about deglobalization and then the world is flat, right? I mean, it's not. We knew it was not, and it's not going to be flat, and the world is not deglobalized because there's a reason why firms go to operate in foreign markets in the first place. So that's really not going to change anytime soon. So that's the piece, that's the first piece. And then the second piece for me is how the digitalization and technology affects businesses and consumers, and how this allows companies or prevents companies from adopting more active stance on a lot of these issues. So that's why I agree with what you said. I mean, managing a brand is really very difficult probably at this time because of these two trends, globalization and deglobalization arguments, and then this technology and digitalization issues that make life really difficult, as exemplified in this great discussion and all the examples that you have given.
Would any of our panelists like to comment on that?
Yeah, just a couple of, like I did think of it in terms of digitalization and how difficult it is for the manager to deal. Also, not only because we don't have television anymore, but we used to be able to, like as a marketer, we used to be able to target our messages much more efficiently in the sense of if I wanted, I could, as a big marketer, I could target both groups that may hate each other, and they may not know that I'm targeting both of them. And now that's just not possible anymore. So if you want to be big on X, you have to understand that the anti-X people are going to hate you one way or the other. And that brings a lot of complexity to the role of the marketer. And that's why I thought of thinking of these cultural models as a way to understand the complexity, because first, it helps you understand where are these people coming from. So where is this anti-X coming from? What is the cultural model that is behind what they're saying and doing? And also thinking of the different people that are involved in this meaning making process, right? So it's not just the marketer, but you have to understand that, like, consumers, other people that you may not even know, like influencers, they have a role to play in this process. So that's why I share some of these theoretical perspectives.
Ella, you wanted to jump in?
I did. The other thing that jumped to my mind is that brands and brand meanings are dynamic. And by that, I mean that they change over time. So whereas before we would think of them as more or less static, you're an entrepreneur, you're a company, you create a brand, you work really hard, you do your market research, you come up with a segmentation, targeting, and positioning strategy. And that positioning really used to stick for arguably the lifetime of a brand, but that's no longer the case. We see increasingly brands having multiple meanings at the same time, their meanings changing over time, pivoting once scandals hit. So that, to me, is the definition of dynamism and brand meanings, and it's adding to
I think we lost you there for a second. Ella,
but
would you like to jump in?
Yes, I just want to tag along what Ella said earlier. I think adding to this complexity is the fact that through technology, through digitalization, the stakeholders that did not necessarily had voice now have voice. Like, everybody has a voice and everybody has an opinion, and they are expressing their opinions continuously without a filter on social media. So you lose track of what's real, what's not real. So brands also have to, navigate this complexity as well. How do you manage your brands in an ideologically really complex environment? Adding to that, we don't even know what's real and what's not real.
All right, so this next question is going to go towards Ella, but everyone can chime in on it. But I think it aligns mostly with what you were talking about. Well, it aligns directly, and I think it was in response to what you had said, but it came anonymously to me, so we'll go with that. The question is, and I'm trying to rephrase it a little bit, how can you be an inclusive brand when the world is so divided over inclusivity and kind of that moral element of what's right and what's wrong from a global standpoint?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and one that we're currently grappling with in our ongoing project. But I think ultimately, to be an inclusive brand is to pick a definition of inclusivity and stick to it and follow it throughout all of the marketing and branding efforts that you are making as a brand manager, and trying not to be a brand that pleases all sides, because that has become increasingly impossible given the online conversations, the various storms that brands face. but trying to be as transparent as possible throughout your whole organization so that it doesn't look like a PR stunt, whatever definition and position you pick of inclusivity. Because ultimately consumers and other stakeholders are increasingly seeing if this is just to sell more, I don't know, shoes or socks, rather than caring for the deeper issues that are part of the DEI conversation.
Excellent.
If
Go
I may
ahead.
add to that, it's not when companies do this, and it shouldn't be just an external effort. It should also trickle down, or it should be represented internally as well, those ideals of whatever they mean by inclusivity, right? So this day and age, we still have corporations that tout DEI because it's fashionable to do so, but they don't have nursing, rooms in their buildings. They don't accommodate moms, or they don't accommodate other groups of employees rather, sorry. So it's not just an external effort. It needs to be communicated and implemented internally as well.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to throw these next set of questions to the panel, and whoever wishes to respond can. What have you experienced as the greatest challenges for your work to gain traction within the review process? Are there certain journals that are more open to it, or others are less open to it? So that'll be the first question. That's the easy one. They get more provocative as we go on.
I can kick us off. So from my end, as a PhD student, I started studying Roma individuals and their consumption behavior, and what has been increasingly challenging across journals was to explain what the Roma ethnicity is in Europe, which is where the context that I'm studying it, and to try and get reviewers to understand what gypsy means and why it is a negative connotation, and why it is a racist term, because in a lot of cultures, gypsy is just a mythological creature, if you will, something that is not real, or someone that is not real. There are a whole slew of Halloween costumes. We just had Halloween, so this is top of mind, that are about gypsies. So it was hard to translate the context of research to go within the review process, but not impossible. Just some colleagues don't think that anything is racist as long as it continues to sell. Sorry, but that's the truth.
Claudio?
So I do agree that not all journals are equally open to qualitative research, and there's also a particular way to frame qualitative research so that it becomes publishable. I do think one challenge that I think, I don't know what the others experience, but it's just like very laborious. Like it's just a long process to get to a point where you have a product as a researcher, from the data collection to the publishing stage. And it is harder for reviewers to get access and give like super insightful concept ideas or questions. Like sometimes it's harder to make your point across. And I think another broad that I've seen, not only myself but also as a reviewer, one issue that I see common in qualitative researchers is to develop theory, like to go like from describing what you're seeing in the data to creating a conceptual model and to share something that people would say, okay, this looks like a theory. So that's another challenge that I see to translate our research into publishable products.
Excellent, thank you. Elif?
I would add to that. I agree with what Ella and Claudia have said so far. I think I would add to that by saying that the complexity, the challenge with publishing in managerially oriented journals, publishing qualitative research in managerially oriented journals, is that they want you to get to the question and get to the results really quickly. And then the beauty of qualitative research is the richness of the context. So you have to do a lot of hand-holding, explaining the context, especially if this is a non-Western context, to the reviewers, explaining the richness of the data and the method. But by then you are halfway into the manuscript. So it can be an uphill battle sometimes when you're trying to tackle all these challenges at the same time, and it can end up being a more time-consuming process.
Excellent, thank you.
If I can add just another aspect, that is the branding aspect to it, again, and that's in my experiences. There are very different perspectives on branding. And like within like the three of us, we share a lot of our thoughts, but that's not the case. And when you submit a paper to a journal, so some certain things that for us, we like, as a panelist, you may have heard all of us saying the same thing, but for some reviewers, it's like, that's just nonsense. It's just not what brands are. So it becomes a little bit harder to manage the process when you have like such distance. And I think this is not only qualitative. I've heard this from quantitative, like quant people. They always say like branding is like a tricky area because reviewers have very particular types of issues and types of perspectives that they bring to the reviewing process. So that's another aspect of it.
Okay, as I said, I'm going to get a little bit more provocative, maybe. Some may argue that the journals have a specific political perspective. And when we're dealing with cultural meanings, I'm particularly drawn to Elif's kind of sort of, I just wonder how a pro-Scientology paper would necessarily play, or a pro-QAnon paper would play within the marketplace. Or you speak to delegitimization, and that's in a number of people's work, right? Legitimization and delegitimization, and sort of when we're seeing that within the political spectrum of legitimizing or delegitimizing brands. And so as this webinar series is a platform for researchers, any anonymous things you could share that would help people, because you always want to say, hey, this would be a great topic and it's really provocative, but how do some of these topics play within the process? Any thoughts?
I think the key is that you have to position it in a language, in a fashion that would be really relevant in terms of either the times or managerial practice, so that even reviewers or journals have their own ideologies about something, they cannot argue with its relevance and importance. Maybe that could be one way to deal with that. I was lucky as a PhD student. I did not encounter any kind of these kinds of challenges. And at the time, this is close to, still relatively close to post 9/11. So I did not encounter any of those kinds of ideological challenges trying to get my paper through about Islamism. And I haven't experienced those kinds of ideological challenges at my institution either. My colleagues have been all very supportive, even though this is a niche area, but sometimes that could happen. And I think the challenge then becomes framing in a way that is managerially relevant or socioculturally so important and relevant that no one can argue against it.
Other thoughts or comments, Ella?
I think thinking through how to generalize some of the generalize beyond the context that you're studying, generalize some of the theories, the managerial implications, the conceptual pieces that you're proposing or ideas, I think really go a long way to ensure positive outcome in a journal review process. So generalizability will be the word that I'm going to throw out there.
Excellent. Claudia?
What I could add to what they were saying is that in the reviewing process, you can try to signal, because I see the ideological divide playing out similarly to what I said before about how brands work. So like in the reviewing process, reviewers will bring their own cultural models about what is a brand and what is the good ideology or the bad ideology. And that's just part of the process. You can signal that to the editors, and if there are particular people or reviewers that you can anticipate that will be particularly contrary to less helpful, you can signal that in the process. But that is just part of, and again, like as long as you can show, as Ella was saying, that you have a theory, the paper should be less about promoting an ideology and more about building theory from that ideology, right? So, and we've had great papers, like I was thinking of the Hummer paper that was at the same time using like the context of the Prius versus the Hummer cars to explore how consumers use that for their own moral reasoning and to frame themselves as morally better than the other. And you can show both Prius and Hummer playing similar roles. So it should be less about promoting the ideology and more about building theory from the ideology.
Excellent. Now, you are all outstanding scholars, but you also serve as gatekeepers because you review papers that come through. And since the webinar series sort of touches on all aspects, obviously we're scholars trying to get work within the process. I was wondering if you have ever thought of if you could give one or two pieces of advice to a scholar, a young scholar, or a seasoned scholar, that would be, you've touched on things like positioning and theory contribution, but like if you just had like two pieces of advice to give a scholar as they're thinking about either the ideation of the idea, the creation of the idea, or positioning it within so that it can be more effective in the review process, what would those pieces be? And I would ask who would like to go first.
I can throw one specific tip that helps me as a reviewer, and it's very specific. Have a conceptual model. Like if you can draw a model, like a figure that shows the main constructs you're dealing with and how they relate to each other, even if they are like those messy arrows, and at least it helps people organize. Okay, these are the buckets that you're dealing with, that you're thinking as important, and so it guides the reviewer process. Like, okay, I want to, now I know what I'm wrestling with, because sometimes papers get too lost in the details and don't give the necessary emphases on how the whole story is organized. So having a figure, conceptual model helps.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ella next.
My piece of advice for positioning is to always move beyond the context that you're studying. So it's never enough to say we've studied X in the US or North America, but we haven't studied it in Canada or Romania or I don't know, across the Atlantic. So that is never enough for a positioning. You have to join a conversation that and go beyond the context that you're investigating.
I love the join the conversation comment because that is what our literature is a conversation. Excellent. Elif?
I would encourage authors to reflect on the concept that they're working with. I would encourage them to reflect on that concept and how it is used and works outside of our discipline sometimes, or neighboring disciplines, because that brings richness to the paper, and it allows them to deliver a richer positioning, theoretical grounding. So being well versed in our own literatures sometimes is not enough, and we can think about how our concepts, our constructs are used in other literatures, at least relevant and neighboring literatures.
Yeah, well, that's a great point too. I will say all of them are great points. I've had a number of people tell me put a conceptual model in my paper after I've gotten, rejected or in the review process. And I will say that the review process is always saying, hey, you're only looking at this narrow set of journals, look more broadly. So excellent context. Well, unfortunately, our time here is coming to a close. It goes so quickly with these. I want to thank our three panelists. Absolutely fabulous presentations, great thoughts, great conversation. So much appreciate your time and your sharing with the audience your thoughts. I want to thank the audience, for our participants, for coming and attending the webinar. It's so wonderful. I need to give a big shout out to Amit Gurja, my brother in crime here in these series that we've been doing. It's been wonderful working with Amit on these. And one last shout out to the MSU staff who help us put together, and the staff here at the TAMU SIBS. Laura here with us today, and Katie Lane, my director. Amit, I'll turn it over for you for any last closing comments, but thank you everyone for everything you've done in the seminar.
David, thank you. It's a pleasure to work with you on these Research Spotlight series, and this is our third year, and every time we have a new set of panelists, I really feel like, well, this was the best. And really, this was really a very good panel, and thank you for a great discussion and very useful insights and tips, issues related to the meaning of brands in an international context. We covered a lot of ground here conceptually, methodologically, and I personally truly enjoyed this discussion, and I hope our panelists, our participants also enjoyed it, and I'd like to thank them for joining us today as well. And of course, special thanks go to our staff in Cybers and the Department of Education grant, the Cyber grant, that make these types of events possible. And I'm certainly looking forward to seeing you again in one of our events as a participant or as a panelist again. Thank you very much, Ella, Elif, and Claudio, for making this happen. Bye-bye.
Take care, y'all.